The story, as told by an eyewitness to those horrifying events, occurred 20 years ago. It was rumored that some of the participants in that nightmarish incident were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. Hence those who did, can't tell the truth to this day. I was fortunate enough to learn the results of the trip to Pripyat firsthand, hence I'm going to tell you everything as it really was without sugarcoating or censorship. For the first time, James started talking about a trip to the Chernobyl zone after a buddy of his, who was an explorer, mailed him some intriguing photographs. Of course, we're talking about regular mail since electronic mail at that time was not yet sufficiently developed. Going through the photos in his hands, James experienced the unique thrill of an adventurer. By the time he was 20, he already had a few trips to some genuinely terrifying places under his belt. One of them was an abandoned village in the Volga region. Rumor had it that truly horrifying things were happening there, related to cannibalism. Whether this was true or not, after so many years, was hard to tell anyway. James had no intention of doing so. The guy took a lot of great photos and shot a few hours of decent video. He used part of the material in his blog, sold some of it, and kept some for later. But atmospheric shoots in the exclusion zone, that would be something, James thought. Hence the choice was made in favor of Pripyat. James had already found out that you can easily hang out in the exclusion zone for a couple of days without harm to your health. Staying longer was an unjustified risk. And in general, frankly speaking, the guy didn't plan to stay there more than a day. Even so, no matter how you looked at it, the place remained dangerous. The trip to the zone, James decided to carry out with 3 close friends, who were just as daredevilish as he was. Ethan, Johnny, and Max were steeped in the theme of abandoned places and search expeditions to the core, hence they were thrilled to go to Pripyat. It was decided to get to the place through Belarus. Partly, this was because James had several friends in this country from his extreme expeditions that he was really eager to see. But he wasn't planning on overstaying his welcome. And since his pen pal had already given him a detailed map of the city, James decided to explore the city school. Naturally, at this point, it was abandoned and was a rather pathetic sight. But on the other hand, such shots gave James the opportunity to earn good money. I will not waste precious time and describe the explorers' crossing of the border and the path to the city itself. I will only say that everything went well and the guys reached the administrative boundaries of Pripyat. During this time, not a single problem arose on the path of the 4 daredevils that could slow down their movement. Backpacks with equipment and items necessary for the hike hung on the guys' backs. Summer was chosen very successfully so as not to carry a pile of winter things with them. To say that the city looked creepy was an understatement. Windows devoid of glass, shabby, moss-covered doors, were either knocked out and lay nearby, or were held on the word of honor and creaked on rusty hinges with every gust of wind. Fortunately, the school the guys needed was on the outskirts of the city, and to find it, they didn't need to wander around the abandoned city. Of course, James would have gladly explored Pripyat up and down, but he had a tight schedule, so it was either the school or nothing at all. The building of the General Education School No. 1 in the city of Pripyat looked uncomfortable. It was a 3-story building, with massive columns, and a concrete canopy over the entrance, which was leaning to one side. Once upon a time, it was needed to protect students from snow and rain. But now, being held on the word of honor, this canopy could easily become a real trap for the guys, threatening to crush them if it fell from the height. Well, what a place, Max sighed dejectedly. What did you expect? A 5-star hotel? Remember how it was in the cannibal village? And here quite bearable, nothing special. Abandoned, it is abandoned even in Africa, James retorted. And of course, standing at the entrance to the school building, the guys had no idea that at this very moment, a pair of eyes was carefully watching them. James was the first to enter the foyer. Lighting his way with a flashlight, James took a habitual look at the dark corners, then moved on. Each of the 4 guys was a professional in their field and behaved as an experienced explorer should. They spoke in a half-whisper, as if afraid to wake the spirit of time that slept in the walls of this building. Despite the fact that 17 years had passed since the Chernobyl accident, there were still items of everyday life from that era in the school building. Occasionally, there were school diaries, the yellowed pages of which were filled with grades given by teachers, but if the above-mentioned school supplies were quite rare, then notebook sheets littered the school floor with a thick cover, like autumn leaves in November. Since the trip to the exclusion zone was associated with some danger, the guys took weapons with them, of course, not firearms and combat, but traumatic, and only those for which they had all the necessary certificates and permits. 2 traumatic guns for 4 sounded pretty good. Especially if you do not believe in the existence of all sorts of creatures, the stories about which are famous in popular rumor. Since the first floor turned out to be the most contaminated, in James's understanding, it was passable. That is, every, more or less self-respecting explorer considered it his duty to explore it first. But James knew that most of the good stuff was stored higher. There, where most black tourists simply do not bother to climb. Guys, let's go to the second floor with me. Why, look at these diaries here, the guy suggested. Ethan and Johnny agreed immediately, but Max hesitated. For some inexplicable reason, he wanted to stay on the first floor. Besides, Max hoped to find some kind of trophy from a bygone era for himself, and when you wander in a herd, it is unlikely that something will fall to you. No, guys, go without me. If you want, I'll catch up with you a bit later, the guy summed up. James didn't repeat twice and started going up to the second floor. Ethan and Johnny dutifully followed him, like loyal vassals of a fallen king. Max started exploring the school classrooms, most of which were as similar as twin brothers. In each of them stood desks, chairs, and all sorts of other school equipment. In essence, everywhere was the same ruin and mess. Well, what did you expect to see here? Ali Baba's treasures? Max whispered to himself with irony. Suddenly at this moment, a barely audible rustle was heard behind him. Max jumped with surprise, but immediately pulled himself together. Probably a rat, the guy thought. He knew that despite the radiation, animals lived in the exclusion zone, although there were much fewer of them than in non-contaminated areas. But when the noise repeated, Max froze in place and listened. The rustle sounded even closer. And this time, its source was no more than 1.5 meters from the boy. Trying not to think about the bad, the explorer quickly turned around and involuntarily clenched his fists. Max was ready to see anything from a revived statue from a pedestal to an octopus with many tentacles. But to Max's great surprise, in front of him lay a children's briefcase, similar to those carried by schoolchildren in Soviet times. Oh my! It's just a briefcase, Max sighed with relief. But when the boy looked closer, he realized that the briefcase wasn't lying still, it was moving. The briefcase slid across the dusty floor, leaving a long trail behind it, like a snake sliding through desert sands. Max thought all of this was an illusion, brought on by juicy tales of abandoned places and the exclusion zone. But the mysterious briefcase was now only 0.5 meters away from the boy, and it behaved like a living organism. What the hell is this, thought Max, and, with all his strength, kicked the briefcase. Not that the blow was so strong, but still, the boy expected more of an effect from it. But the briefcase only flew 1 meter away, and whatever was in it at that moment, predictably absorbed Max's kick. The boy looked down and saw that his boot was covered with a substance of a crimson color. Trying not to think about the worst, Max leaned over and cautiously touched the sticky substance with his fingers. Of course, the boy was not an expert, but his sixth sense told him that this fatty substance, crimson as broth, was none other than blood. Max didn't want to look inside the briefcase. But he did it anyway, forcing himself. Carefully opening the latches, the boy felt like a bomb disposal expert, defusing a dangerous explosive device, which, with one wrong move, could blow him to bits. Now, all he had to do was to flip open the top half of the briefcase, after which he could look inside. There was definitely something inside it, and whatever it was, it felt soft to the touch. Max felt it, running his hand over the cold surface of the briefcase. But when the boy finally found the strength to look inside, he barely managed to suppress a spasmodic scream that arose in his throat. At the bottom of the briefcase, practically floating in its own blood, lay a dead cat. Since the unfortunate animal's body was bent at an unnatural angle, Max realized that its spine was most likely broken in several places. In disgust, the boy dropped the briefcase from his hands and involuntarily took 2 steps back. All of this looked so terrible that he barely held back the urge to vomit. But Max didn't have time to recover from what he had seen. A new rustle sounded behind the boy again, and it seemed to come from nowhere. A second later, a creeping voice sounded, "Did you do your homework?" The intonation of the speaker reminded Max of a scratched record, making him feel even worse. Trembling with fear, the boy slowly turned around and saw before him what could not have been dreamed of even in a nightmarish dream. At that moment, Max sincerely regretted that he did not go with the others to the 2nd floor, but stayed here to explore everything on his own. First came a bitter realization of the mistake made, and second, a horrible pain that originated in the pit of his stomach and ascended all the way to his throat. Max didn't have time to scream at full power because his throat was instantly filled with a considerable amount of blood, which prevented the boy from letting out a dying, agonizing scream. Falling onto the dust-covered floor of the school classroom, the boy heard in his ears the same voice that had delivered another horrible phrase, "Sit down, you get a D." At this very moment, John, Robert, and James were roaming through the junk-filled corridor of the 2nd floor. What a mess! It's like a garbage dump. The students and teachers were evacuated, right? John remarked, grimacing. Yeah, who knows? Maybe looters did this, replied James. All this time, he had an unsettling feeling that seized him after the entire group crossed the threshold of this school. Frankly speaking, the 2nd floor greatly disappointed him. Of course, James managed to take a few successful pictures. But to travel such a long way for this, in his understanding, was reckless at least. Damn, what is Max doing there? Did he find something worth it? Robert voiced his assumption. I doubt it. If you want, you can call him from the stairs. John brushed it off. Following his friend's advice, Robert went halfway down the stairs, then loudly called Max by name. But all that answered him was the echo, repeatedly reflected off the building walls. And, no matter how much Robert shouted, Max was still out of his sight. Guys, something's not right. I think we need to all go down and see what's going on. All these divisions will lead us to no good, said a frightened Robert. James and John shared a knowing look, after which they began to slowly descend to the 1st floor. Robert was the first to find Maximum. Although he himself would have preferred not to see this. Max lay in a pool of his own blood, and a little further away were his intestines, stretched across the floor like disgusting spaghetti. It seemed that blood was everywhere and, realizing this, plunged his friends into shock. And when James looked at the school blackboard, he saw a fat D on it, which, apparently, had been written in fresh blood of the murdered Maximum. What the hell happened here? James whispered in horror. But he could not get an answer to his question. It was not that Robert and John knew no more than him. It was because the schoolroom was suddenly filled with a nasty, mechanical trill, which each of them had heard hundreds of times in their childhood. Only one thing in the world sounds like that, and its name is school bell, announcing the start or end of a lesson. And in our case, a deadly lesson.